All right, guys, welcome to Standard 1.5, which has to do with the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to try to get through as much of this in one video as I can, but in class, it actually took us 3 days to do. I call it in the notes Standard 1.5A, B, and C. So you might want to fast forward a little bit through the video if you're looking for one of those other chunks. Today, at least the first section of this, what we're going to talk about is how the Constitution fixed the problems that the Articles had, how they dealt with the various compromises they had at the Constitutional Convention. That's all in A. In B, we talk a little bit more about the principles that underlie the Constitution. And then in C, we talk about the process of ratification and discuss the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So hopefully I can get at least A and B into one video, but if not, you will know what the difference is, okay? So let's jump into this. Where we are right now in this picture is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A number of delegates have gotten together from around the states, and they were going to deal with the problems that were raised by the Articles of Confederation. At first they met because they wanted to try to fix the problems, but they realized pretty quickly they couldn't fix it. And so after just 5 days, they vote to scrap it and start over from scratch. So now they're going to write a brand new document called the Constitution. At first, what we talk about is how the Constitution is going to try to fix problems that the Articles had. So, for example, there was no central government under the Articles of Confederation. But in the Constitution, they say, yes, we do need a central government. We need some unity between the 13 states. And if there's ever some kind of a conflict between the states, we need a government to settle that dispute. So they do that. I'll actually start with the bottom chunk here first. In order to settle those disputes, they set up a judicial branch, which, if you remember, the Articles of Confederation didn't even have. So there's going to be a judicial branch. On top of that, they say, we have a problem. Every single state is issuing its own currency. So if you go from South Carolina to North Carolina over the weekend to pick apples back in, I don't know, 1788, I guess that would have worked, then you're going to have to exchange your money. You're going to have to exchange your South Carolina dollars for North Carolina dollars. And every time you do that, you lose a little bit because whoever changed your money charges you a fee. That's not good. So the central government is going to be the only one who can print currency, and they're the only ones who can control commerce, that's trade between the states. That just solves a lot of the issues that they were having. On top of that, the central government is the only one that they allow to have the power to make diplomatic treaties with other countries. That's obvious. We don't want to have every single colony or state have to go back to England or Spain or France or whoever to make an agreement individually. We're going to have one treaty that applies to all of the states. This makes us much stronger diplomatically. So you've got the baby doing the push-ups because he's young, but he's strong, and that's kind of what we were at that point. Now, we are going to have a little bit of tension here because it used to be that the states had all the power. But now we have two different entities that have power. So think of this as like a Venn diagram where you have the states that have some power and the central government that has some power. And there are some things that overlap too, okay? That's not a very good Venn diagram. I totally get that. But the idea is that there are going to be some things that only the federal government can do, like declare war. South Carolina really shouldn't have that right. There are some things that only the states need to do or should do, like deciding who can be married or deciding who gets a gun license or a hunting license. So every state gets to do its licensing just a little bit different. Okay, that's why the ages to get married varies from state to state. There are some things that both the state and the central government can do, like both of them can tax you, for example. Okay, we call this a federal system of government. The idea that there's a central government, this is the central government, the state government, and there's some things that both of them have the power to do. They also decided that the Constitution, unlike the Articles, could be amended a little bit more easily. Okay, the Articles, you had to have every single state agree before you could get any changes or any amendments. But in the Constitution, only 3/4 of the states have to agree. That's still pretty difficult to do, but it's a whole lot easier than getting everybody to agree. On top of that, they say we really need 3 different branches of government. It's not enough to just have a legislature to try to decide things like the Articles of Confederation had. We also need an executive, somebody to carry out those laws. We need a judicial branch to determine what happens when you break those laws. And so we're going to have three branches. Everybody agrees on all these things I've talked about so far. They all agree that they're needed. However, there are three big conflicts that are going to crop up during the Constitutional Convention. And we're going to talk about each of these three in order. First of all, we're going to talk about representation in Congress. Secondly, we're going to talk about how they're going to count slaves. And third, there's an issue with trade, and specifically the slave trade. So let's jump into the first one. See, Virginia shows up to the Constitutional Convention, and Virginia says, you know what? It didn't make any sense that under the Articles, every state got the same number of votes. Because some states have a lot of people. Some states have very few people. Okay? Some states had hundreds of thousands of people, and others had tens of thousands. So Virginia's argument is, should all those states get the same number of votes? And the big states like New York agree and say, absolutely, the bigger states should get more votes. So this plan to have more representatives for states that are larger, we call this the Virginia Plan. And there's actually a little more to the Virginia Plan, but for our purposes, this is what we're going to focus on. Now, you can probably guess who would not be really happy with that idea. That would be the smaller states. So smaller states like New Jersey said, wait, this worked okay under the Articles of Confederation. We don't see the need to change this. And so the New Jersey plan says, no, let's continue to allow every state an equal number of votes. Other small states like Rhode Island agree and say this is a good plan. Let's go with New Jersey. Now, this seems like a pretty easy deal. But some of the small states and some of the big states actually felt so strongly about this that they were about to walk. They're going to leave and forget writing a constitution unless they can solve this thing. So fortunately, we talked about what you would propose in class. Fortunately, Connecticut steps in and says, let's have a compromise. Sometimes it's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Instead of just having a one-house legislature, which we had in the Articles of Confederation, let's have a two-house legislature. So a Senate and a House of Representatives. The Senate, we're going to do what New Jersey suggested, and everybody gets an equal number of votes. Specifically, everybody gets 2 votes. In the House of Representatives, on the other hand, we're going to give the bigger states a greater number of votes. So Virginia today, or California, or Texas, get a whole lot more votes than, say, South Carolina, or maybe Wyoming on the extreme end of it. That makes a lot of sense. And both the big states and the small states say, I can live with that. And I think that's a good plan. Here's the second problem, and this is not in your notes directly, but I want to draw your attention to this thing. What you see in this column right here is the total population in a given state. This column shows you the total number of slaves, and the final column shows you the percentage of each state that was made up of slaves. Unfortunately, I do have to highlight that South Carolina at that time, which is 1790, had a greater percentage of slaves than any other state, even though Virginia actually had more slaves. That's really a sad thing, but think about this in terms of what we just talked about. Some states, or in the House of Representatives, all states are going to have the number of representatives they get based on that state's population. So should South Carolina and Virginia and other slave states get to count their slaves toward the number of representatives that they receive? That's a tricky question, because the slaves, of course, don't get to vote, which means that the people who will represent them, if there are representatives, are going to be rich white men. Probably not people who are going to have the best interests of slaves at heart. So the question, and just to be very, very clear, what your notes say is the South wants to count them because they've got a lot of them. And the North says, no way are you going to count those. That gives you an unfair advantage, and you don't even let those people vote. In fact, you guys don't count them as people unless it's so you can get more representatives to represent white planters. That seems a little weird. So the compromise here is that they agree to count slaves, but they will only count them as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 slaves, we're only going to say that those are 3 people. That definitely dehumanizes them. But there's really not a good answer here, because even if we counted them as a full person, they still can't vote, remember, so white people are going to represent the interests of the slaves, and that just isn't going to work. Okay. Finally, the South has a couple issues. Okay? One of them is stated here in the notes, and the other one I'll help you with. The South is really concerned that if the federal government gets the power to make treaties with other countries, they might make treaties that would bring in things like tobacco and rice and indigo from places that might grow it a little bit cheaper. And they don't like that. There's one other major issue, though. That other issue is if the federal government controls the trade, they might decide they're going to stop trading slaves. In other words, we're going to bring in no further people from any entity or any country that we're trading slaves with. The South doesn't like that because they feel like they need slaves. So the agreement is this. The South will allow the government to make treaties as long as the central government promises they will not do anything to the slave trade for 20 years. That would be 1808. The reason for that, I'm going to go back really, really quick to this picture here. Most of these guys in 20 years are not going to be around anymore. Okay? They're kicking this issue down to the next generation. And I know some of these guys are in their 30s, but even back then, remember, your life expectancy is significantly lower than today. So if you live to be in your 50s or 60s, man, you'd be a really old guy. Okay? So really what they're saying is somebody else is going to have to deal with this. Despite all the disagreements and the need for these compromises, all the framers of the Constitution agree that we needed a more powerful central government, number one. And number two, they agree that we, the people, are the ones who give the government its power. And so on September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was finished, and then it was sent out to the states. We will talk about that in the next couple sections. Actually, I guess it looks like this is going to be the A video. B and C will be separate. So if you need those, you can go ahead and pick those up too. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me at ngallion@greermiddlecollege.org. I hope this has been helpful.